And we understand Russia is now warning Sweden and Finland against joining NATO membership. International Affairs Analyst Dr. Bola Adediran joins me to discuss this and more about the war in Ukraine. Good to have you join us.
My pleasure.
And great to have you in person in the studio. We've always spoken virtually whilst you're in the UK, but great to have you here in Nigeria.
Thank you.
So let's talk about this. This seems like a paradox, doesn't it? Because the reason Russia invaded Ukraine was to deter Ukraine and other countries from joining NATO. Now, it does seem like that has also now galvanized the passion or that feeling of fear to join Ukraine from Sweden and Finland, that there is now support for these two countries to join NATO. What do you make of this?
You're absolutely very correct. It's an unfortunate situation for Russia because, as you've rightly mentioned, Russia is now in a worse security situation than it was in January 2022. Finland and Sweden have always maintained some form of neutrality. In fact, Finland signed an agreement with Russia in 1948, basically guaranteeing some form of neutrality in the Cold War. And Sweden has also taken that kind of step previously. So those two countries deciding to join NATO, and there is enthusiasm for those two countries to actually join NATO, puts Russia in a terrible situation. Already, there are many countries within the Baltic states that have already joined NATO, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and there is a cycle around Russian territory now composed of NATO states. So this is actually putting Russia in a worst case scenario. Unfortunately, if it was in 2019 or 2020, Russia could probably react, but in this case, the economic sanctions has been boxed in severely. So all the empty threats by Peskov saying that it's warning Finland and Sweden from joining NATO, they're empty threats because they're in a worse security, economic, and financial situation than previously.
And do you think, I mean, Russia already reacted, it reacted with Ukraine, and do you think that reaction, people realized, look, we know what you can do now, so we are going to go ahead to protect ourselves. And then I also know that somehow Sweden and Finland were like super partners of NATO, but not necessarily a member of NATO. And do you think that they've also now realized that being a partner of NATO doesn't guarantee the security because that Article 5 covering is in there?
That Article 5 covering is a powerful covering and makes NATO one of the most important defensive allied security organizations that we've ever seen. And NATO is growing and growing by the day, not only in terms of members now committing a significant amount of their annual budgets to defense spending. So NATO is getting stronger, all because of what Russia has done. NATO countries realized that Russia's aggression which was absolutely uncalled for, which was absolutely wrong, creates a security problem in Europe, the likes that we've not seen on before. I mean, since the Cold War ended. So I think that Finland and Sweden are in a situation where this is the best time for them to join, just because there is legitimacy for them to do so. The West is absolutely inviting them, willing to embrace them, and Russia cannot do anything about it. And as you've mentioned, we've seen before where security guarantees outside of Article 5 has not done anything. Remember that when Ukraine gave its nuclear weapons to Russia in 1994 under the Budapest Memorandum, it had its security guaranteed by Russia, by the West. And it was invaded in 2014 by Crimea. Nothing was done. It was invaded now fully in 2022. Nothing was done. So unless you have a security guarantee, that NATO provides.
But I want to pick up on something you said when you said this is the best time to join, because there are also analysts, especially security analysts, who are wondering how much of a good decision it is for NATO to be expanding in the middle of a war, especially because that's the reason for the war in the first place. And then there are those who also wonder if NATO membership is a security guarantee for the European continent.
NATO membership is absolutely a security guarantee, a watertight security guarantee. Russia would not even dare attack a NATO country. It would back, but it wouldn't bite. And that is a very clear. In terms of NATO, NATO expansionism, I think that previously there were concerns about it, that in fact some people really, Eric Kissinger, for instance, the former Secretary of State in the US, warned against NATO expansion, said, for instance, Ukraine should not be admitted into NATO. But those times have changed, those times have passed. Russia partly has made those this situation worse. And I think that NATO has much more legitimacy to expand now. Everyone understands that for there to be stability in Europe, NATO has to do what it has to do. And also because Russia is just really weak now. We've seen how Russian soldiers have died in their thousands and how Russia has prosecuted a war that everyone thought would be easy for it, that it would steamroll Ukraine. And we've seen that that has not happened. The Russian Air Force is nowhere to be found. Its military is in disarray. And so more than any time in history, we're seeing that the Russian army is not what we thought it was. It's a big power, but it's not proven itself as a big power in this situation.
So there is a military crisis and there is an economic crisis that Russia has to deal with. But there is also the issue of negotiation between both countries, that's Ukraine and Russia. Now, with this new, or this latest development of Sweden and Finland membership, as it were, or the proposed membership, how do you think that plays out on the war and then negotiations?
I think that these are independent situations. Obviously, Russia keeps in mind that the expansion of NATO means that whatever guarantees that NATO is probably giving on the sidelines of the talk. NATO is not a key partner in this negotiations. It's really between Ukrainian government and the Russians. But also, everyone has kind of put a lot of doubt on the peace talk and the peace treaty, saying that Russia is not really serious about it. So I don't think this really changes much for Ukrainians because they know that they have to defend their country with their life. For Russia, it probably only makes a lot of difference in terms of understanding very well, clearly now, that NATO is willing to expand and to disregard its interests, in a bare, bold-faced way. But I think that I had not had any previous sort of optimism for the peace talks previously. I think that Russia is intent on at least ensuring that its sphere of influence is restricted around the Donbas region, and that's why we're seeing most of its forces moving to the eastern part of Ukraine now and consolidating that. And I don't think any part of the treaty would concede Crimea or the Donbas region to Ukraine under any terms of the treaty. It's been very clear from the get-go that Luhansk and Donetsk will be part of Russian sphere of influence.
And let's switch gear now to talk about the idea that chemical weapon might have been used in Ukraine by Russian forces, and it's been called a poisonous substance. If this were found to be true, we understand that U.S. and Britain would go ahead and verify. If this were to be true, what would be a meaningful sanction or consequence for Russia in this situation?
A meaningful sanction definitely would be stop buying Russian gas and oil. It would put a lot of strain on the economies of European countries, but it would eat Russia financially more than any other sanction has, because Russia continues to fund this war partly from the resources and the finances it gets from selling oil and gas to Europe. But I think that we shouldn't be surprised that there is indication that Russia may have used chemical weapons in Ukraine. It has an history of doing that. It did that in Afghanistan in 1979. It did that. It basically covered the Syrian government when it used chemical weapons in Homs in 2014 and in many situations. And it's used chemical agents and chemical weapons on the streets of Salisbury, not far from where I lived, actually. So Russia has it has an history of being this kind of malignant international actor.
I mean, the developments are just disturbing, but we'll see how it plays out and how the international community continues to react to this. Thank you so much for talking to us. International Affairs Analyst, Dr. Bola Adediran.
Thank you very much.